Thank you, everyone. I greatly appreciate being here. Fenella's right. Just minutes ago, I was trying to check my phone like everybody else, trying to do math as quickly as possible to find out the election. I do not have the answer for you, I'm sorry to tell you. But I do want to talk today about democracy. And one of the first questions that I often get asked by Australians is, well, how are you feeling about it? And I tell them it's a mix of emotions. I feel surprise, I feel disappointment, I feel frustration, I feel impatience, like a lot of people. But I also often think a lot about a relative of mine who I called earlier this week, and I said, how are you feeling? How are things in the country? And she said, I've never felt so unsettled. And I think that's really how a lot of people feel in America and around the world. But in a year of COVID and a year of bushfires, I've also really found myself thinking a lot about the American cult of individualism and the need to push ourselves beyond our comfort zones into areas of life and interactions that actually have nothing to do with politics. But let's talk about Trump for a second. He's often described as the id of American life, right? The primal instincts of humanity, the primal instincts of the country writ large. And while I think that might be true, he's also the apotheosis of individualism as well. And I keep thinking about something that he's been saying since 2016, and he said a lot during the campaign and at the very end to all his supporters, which was, "I am your voice." And it made me think of a phrase that most Americans learn at a very young age when they can first read and they can look at their coins, because it says e pluribus unum. It says out of the many, one. It's a Latin phrase that the founding fathers really fell in love with in 1776 and started putting on coins in 1795. And what it means, or the idea that they had, was that a nation would come together of different nationalities, different states, different points of view, and come together and be unified as one. It was an ideal, not a person. Trump was trying to make that about himself, which is not a surprise. This is something that he's done throughout his career. He's always been the I in his America. One of the things that a colleague of mine wrote is that Trumpism is a performance of success and power that urges the public to identify with it and adopt it as its own. And so what he's doing is not just talking about himself, he's encouraging Americans to see themselves in him and try to repeat what he does, the performance. To be Trumpian is to perform as if you're succeeding. To be Trumpian is to perform for yourself and for those who agree with you and think just like you. This election then can be seen as a test of whether or not Americans want to continue down a path of individualism and of I, or to possibly recalibrate, even just a little. And what do we know so far? We know that the country is still pretty unsure about which way it wants to go on this topic, at least. The election is very, very close. It's closer than a lot of the pollsters or anyone figured. President Trump has already gotten more votes than he did last time around. There are a lot of Americans who have bought into his argument. And what's clear is that even after he's gone, these ideas will continue to be there. They preceded him, and they will continue after him. I have a lot of relatives who vote for Trump and voted for him last time and really on the fence this time. And there are a lot of different things that they say to me. But part of it is about a sense of strength, a sense of fear of loss and status and insecurity. Sometimes people who vote for a candidate are actually voting against something else. And I think that's what happens a lot in this case, too. We often think of political divisions as tribalism. And I think that that's probably true. But what I also think is happening in America is an almost narcissism of narrowing perspective. The country, no matter which side you're on, is finding ways to just shrink itself and look through a narrower lens. This is in no way an attempt at equivalence. Trump is unmatched in his blindness to others. But what I'm describing is a narcissism that exists on both the left and the right. The left doesn't look at the conservatives who quietly try to live with integrity. Maybe it's their child's coach, soccer coach, or someone they grew up with who always tried to be kind and dignified. They only see Trump and what they describe as his deplorables. The right doesn't look at Biden or the progressives who live their lives to be kind and don't just argue on Twitter. They only see those who are like Antifa, the ones who they think are committing violence. Or take an issue like immigration. If you oppose immigration, then the only thing you're likely to focus on is that person who came to the country and committed some horrible crime, and that's what you're going to talk about. If you support immigration, you're likely to pick up on that saint and say, this is what immigrants are all about. They've come here and they've helped themselves to the freedom of democracy and succeeded, and this is the only thing that they are. Before this election, just to use another example, I heard people from both sides of the United States say, it's only the other side that's organizing violence. Our side isn't doing any of it. And that inability to see both the flaws within your own tribe, within your own group, is dangerous and toxic in the same way that it's dangerous and toxic to only see the good within your side and to not be able to imagine that the other actually has goodness as well. There's often an inability to slow down, to soften, to think, to ask questions, to listen and to find common ground. It's almost as if there's been a Twitterization of the entire political discourse. It's a threat to America, and it's a threat that challenges every democracy in the world. How do you avoid letting your politics block you from a connection with others? How do you avoid thinking you're always right and what's right for you is right for all? How do you avoid making the many into many enemies? But let's step back for a second and try to figure out, how did we get so divided? The culture of what I call self-righteous individualism has been building for a really long time. Some researchers put the beginning of this individualism with Greece, before Christ. The idea was that in these small island states, island city-states like Athens, you had to really hustle to do well. You didn't join some big farming collective. You weren't part of some giant movement. You were maybe a fisherman and you had to sell your wares on yourself. You had to hustle. You had to be looking out for number one. And not surprisingly, this is where democracy emerges, right? Around 500 BC, with the idea of the rule by the people. And it's a real bet on human nature. It's a real bet on humanity. And that's a wonderful thing. And for a while, it works in a system that's not so different than what we have now, which is pretty amazing. That was a long time ago, right? You've got two assemblies, one for the people, one that's a little bit smaller. You've got independent courts. You've got people speaking up about what they want and what they want their government to be. But it didn't last that long. Within a few generations, the system starts to devolve into more of an aristocracy, more of what Herodotus called the one man, the best. This is when we had General Pericles, and the idea is sort of a strong man with an elite around them. So what does this tell us? It tells us that a fundamental challenge of democracy has always been finding a way to avoid the chaos and cacophony of too many voices, which produces a desire for less democracy and fewer people in charge. And it means finding a balance between the individual and the collective. In America, the world's oldest modern democracy, what it feels like these days is a little bit like the Big Bang. People are just drifting further and further apart in the momentum that started a long time ago. Life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, or property, which is what they had originally written, is, after all, not really a shared goal. It's about you as an individual. Sometimes I think about, what would America look like if other virtues had been proposed at that early point? What if it was the search for strength and solidarity and a pursuit of the common good? But Americans have chosen freedom as their ideal, and that can be a wonderful thing. But the momentum has been building for a while. And I think that's why the Founding Fathers actually chose a phrase like e pluribus unum, because they knew that it was going to be really hard to hold people together. They knew that unity was a goal. And these days, it just feels almost like an aspiration that is still very much in process, and that we may be further away from it than we were at the beginning. The pace of entropy has often been feeling like it's accelerating. We now live in a world where our algorithms tell us what we want to hear, and we think everyone sees the exact same things that we see, but they don't. That's the model that America is exporting to the world. Attention to self, not to others. So where does it lead? There are a few statistics that I often think of when I talk to Australians about what America is like and the direction that it's been heading for years. One is that 1 in 4 Americans are so lonely that they don't even have a single confidant who they can talk to in a time of trouble. There's an epidemic of loneliness that has been identified in the past few years, but has been around for a while. Another study found that 1 in 4 Americans, and this one really hit me, don't feel like anyone can understand them. Look at the election and think that a quarter of Americans feel like no one gets them, and think about how that drives their politics. At the same time, Americans have become less involved with every kind of social group imaginable. Robert Putnam wrote about bowling, but it's not just that Americans are bowling alone. They're not joining civic groups, they're not volunteering in the same numbers, they're not joining sports clubs. And this isn't just true of America, this is true of other democracies as well. In Australia, since the 1960s, there's also been an epidemic of disconnection. Fewer and fewer people are joining sports clubs, fewer and fewer people are joining social groups. Social networks outside of our electronic social networks in Australia are also shrinking. But in America, it's even more extreme. And I think sometimes it comes down to something really simple, something we all think about only in terms of real estate, which is location. 6 out of every 10 Americans now live, or at least as of 4 years ago, live in a place called a landslide county. So what this means is this is a county where more than 60% of the voters have chosen one candidate. So we hear a lot about swing states and swing counties, but the reality is that most Americans live in a place where nearly everyone votes the same way they do. And this is up from 40% of counties that people lived in those kinds of counties in 1992. So just in that span, we have more and more people who are just clustering together with people of the same ideas. In this year's election, I talked to a couple experts before I came, it's expected to increase and intensify even more. Just to give you an example, I was looking at the numbers before I came. In Manhattan, 84% of the voters voted for Biden. In Wallace County, Kansas, a small county in the northern tip of Kansas, 94% voted for Trump. This is the kind of thing that's happening all over the country. And what that means is that most Americans live in a place where they don't interact regularly with people who they might disagree with. Our filter bubbles are not just online. Our filter bubbles are at our cafes, they're at our parent-teacher conferences, they're at our offices, they're in all kinds of places that we just don't even think about. And what it often does is it creates a coded expectation of speech and belief. The conversation you overhear, you're assumed to believe the same way as somebody else. Whether you're in a farm town that votes Trump or a city that votes Biden, there's a set of social norms that you're supposed to subscribe to. And if you don't, you end up feeling alienated. I know this from conservatives who live in New York City and from liberals who live in other parts of the country where they feel alienated as well. And all it does is push people further apart. So how do we turn this around? Well, democracies ever since the Greeks have been struggling to find some kind of middle ground, right? If you have too much selfishness and individualism, you end up with a push to extremes, which is what I think you've seen in the United States. As we're seeing in America with COVID, people aren't even willing to behave in a way that not just keeps themselves safe, but that keeps everyone else safe. If the Australian modeling, which shows that you need at least 70% of people to behave with social distancing, to follow the basic common sense rules in order to get the virus under control, in the United States, it's never reached close to that number, and that's what you see with the virus. This is not just a problem of Donald Trump, this is a problem that spans the entire country. On the other hand, what happens if you have too much collectivism, too much of this idea that, okay, it's only about for everyone, for others? You know, I've worked in countries like this, and it doesn't work very well. I think of a time when I was in Cuba, and I was interviewing a bunch of people and found out that right after I'd left these people's homes, the secret police had gone to make sure that these people didn't say anything negative to me as a foreign reporter. And I was driving to the airport, and my taxi driver was the one who told me, he said, listen, Damien, all these people have gotten visited. They're all going to get in trouble. You need to throw away your notebook, if it has any other names in it. And so we stopped by a sewer, and I literally ripped out all the pages of my notebook and dumped it in there to try and save or protect anyone who I had talked to whose names that I had in there. And I wasn't even asking them about controversial things. But when you have too much of an emphasis on a universal story, you end up with that, or you end up with what you see in Hong Kong, with China insisting that any sense of dissent is illegal. And I got to tell you, as messy as democracy is, that's a whole lot worse. So what do we do to find middle ground? How do we find a way out of this entropy and this division? Well, one way, I think, is through leadership. If you look at the way Australia and New Zealand, with two leaders from totally different political perspectives, handled the pandemic, you see signs of hope. Morrison is as a conservative, Ardern is quite on the side of the left, but they both chose science and solidarity in order to get people to subscribe to what needed to be done to get the virus under control. I wrote a story that I think ended up on the front page about how these two countries could be models for how to think about how to manage not just epidemics and viruses now, but other kinds of risks and crises in the future. And what has it done? It's restored trust in democracy in both of these countries. Is it perfect? Absolutely not. There are mistakes made in both cases. But it has changed the shift in momentum, it's changed the momentum in terms of how people view government, which is hopeful. The second thing I think, though, is even on a smaller scale, it's community organizations. I'm happen to be working on a book right now about risk in community, and one of the things that I write about is trying to kind of let go of my American individualism. And one of the ways I'm trying to do it is by joining a surf lifesaving club, right? And I don't love the uniforms, I'm not a joiner, it's not something that I really felt like was a natural for me. But I did it, and I have to say, it's shown me the value of throwing yourself into groups and organizations that are about some kind of shared common mission, and where politics has nothing to do with it, where you get to know people outside of what their views are on the latest subject that you're debating about on social media, where you find connection points that have nothing to do with points of disagreement, but rather points of connection. And it's not just at the beach in Australia, of course. It also is other areas, especially that deal with nature. During the fires, I spent a lot of time in communities that were just burned out and struggling. I spent a lot of time with firefighters. And the fact that Australia has such a large volunteer firefighting system is another example of the kind of organization we're talking about. Just recently, I was down actually on the far south coast talking to people about how they're doing a year after the horrible fires last year. And there's a lot of trauma. I mean, people will tell you that just the smell of smoke makes them panic. But at one point, I stopped in at one of the fire sheds, and I was talking to one of the chiefs in the back, and we were looking at these maps of all the land that had been destroyed. And I said, how is the community feeling? And he said, everyone's hurting, but there's also some things that we didn't expect. Like we're having a huge surge of recruitment for volunteer firefighters. So many people are coming forward to try and help their community and help strangers and help themselves. And what's interesting is these tend to be communities that are actually more politically mixed, right? I mean, some of the people I met had long beards, and all they wanted to do was listen to folk music, and they were clearly children of the 1960s. And I mean that in the nicest way possible, but definitely from the left. And then there's farmers, who are also there and trying to figure out how to manage. And in some points, they argue and they fight. But when it comes to dealing with fires and dealing with something that was a great challenge, they came together. What they were trying to do is something that a lot of democracies need to do. They need to turn the one from the many. It begins with where you live and who you get to know. Democracy offers a choice, not just for candidates, but with how we live. And I hope this election takes us to a place where we take bigger risks, not just for the one, but also the many. Thank you.